My parents sold my childhood home to fund my sister's vacations, so I moved far away, and what I did next destroyed their illusions. I'm a 30-year-old guy, and the house I grew up in wasn't just a building, it was the only place that ever felt safe. My late grandfather built it with his own hands, back when life moved slower and family meant everything. The floors still creaked the same way they did when I was a kid, sneaking down for midnight snacks. The scent of old pine, mixed with my mother's cinnamon candles, it was comfort in its purest form. Every corner held a memory. Birthdays in the backyard, my dad teaching me how to fix the porch light, my mom humming in the kitchen while the radio played softly. I was always the one who kept things running, the one who mowed the lawn, repainted the fence, replaced the old roof when my dad's back gave out. It wasn't out of duty, it was love. That house was a living piece of my grandfather's legacy, and taking care of it felt like protecting a part of him. Just uneven. My parents adored my younger sister, Emily. She was the golden child, bright, charming, and somehow always innocent, no matter how much she messed up. If she crashed her car, Dad blamed the rain. If she failed a class, Mom said the professor was too harsh. Meanwhile, I worked overtime, paid off my student debt, and quietly helped with their bills. I didn't mind at least not then, but lately I'd noticed something off. Whispers between my parents when they thought I wasn't around. Mom nervously checking the mail, Dad pretending the phone calls were wrong numbers. I asked once if everything was okay, and Mom just smiled too quickly. "Don't worry about it, honey. Everything's fine." But it wasn't fine. Something was happening behind closed doors, and deep down, I could feel that our family's foundations, like that old house, was about to crack. Emily came home that summer like a storm in designer heels. It had been almost a year since she graduated college, and somehow she already carried herself like a celebrity. She tossed her luggage into the hallway, kissed Mom on the cheek, and announced, "I'm only here until I figure out my next move." The way she said it made it sound like the world was her stepping stone and we were just the spectators. At dinner, my parents hung on her every word. Emily talked about networking, self-discovery, and traveling to Europe for inspiration. Mom's eyes sparkled like she was listening to a prophet. Dad laughed louder than I'd heard in months. I tried to join the conversation, but when I mentioned my recent promotion at work, Mom just nodded absently before asking Emily if she wanted more mashed potatoes. That moment hit harder than I expected. Later that night, while I was fixing a leak under the sink, I overheard them in the kitchen. Emily was saying, "Everyone I know is going to Bali this summer. It's kind of important for my brand." My father sighed, but Mom's voice was tender. "We'll figure something out, sweetheart. You deserve it. Deserve it." That phrase stuck to me like a thorn. I'd worked years to earn stability. Emily just had to want something. And somehow, it became everyone's mission to make it happen. Over the next week, I noticed Dad making more phone calls, pacing the porch with that old stress vein showing near his temple. One night, I asked him straight out if everything was okay. He forced a half smile. Just some money shuffling, nothing serious. But then I caught a sentence muttered under his breath as he walked away. "Maybe it's time to let go of the old place." My stomach dropped. The old place? He couldn't mean the house, could he? I'll never forget the day I found out. I came home from work, exhausted, but relieved it had been a good week at the office. When I pulled into the driveway, there was a sold sign planted right in front of the yard where I'd learned to ride my bike. For a second, I thought it had to be a mistake. Maybe the neighbors were moving. But then I saw my mom on the porch, nervously wringing her hands. My dad couldn't even look at me. "Tell me that's not ours," I said, my voice cracking halfway through. Dad sighed heavily, his eyes fixed on the floorboards. "Son, we had to make a tough decision." "Tough decision?" I repeated, staring at the sign like it was some sick joke. "You sold our home? Without even telling me?" Mom jumped in, her voice trembling. "We didn't want to worry you. Emily had this opportunity. Her friends are traveling to Europe. It's a once-in-a-lifetime thing, and we just couldn't afford both the mortgage and her vacation." I cut her off. "You sold Grandpa's house so she could go find herself in Europe." The silence that followed was worse than shouting. Emily just stood there, scrolling on her phone like none of it mattered. When I looked at her, she shrugged. "It's not like you even live here anymore." I wanted to scream. Every childhood memory, every nail I hammered, every late night fixing the porch gone. Just like that. They told me I'd understand one day that it was for the family's future. But as I packed up the attic that night, surrounded by boxes of dusty photographs and my grandfather's old tools, one thing became painfully clear. This wasn't about family. It was about favoritism, and I was finally seeing it for what it really was. And as Emily's laughter echoed from her room, I knew something inside me had snapped. Leaving that house felt like tearing out a piece of myself. The movers were strangers, handling my childhood memories like clutter boxes labeled old stuff. The faint smell of sawdust from Grandpa's workbench fading with every step out the door. When I handed over the keys, the new owners thanked me politely, smiling like they'd just bought a dream. For me, it was a funeral. I packed my car with what I could fit and drove 6 hours north to a small city, where no one knew my family name. The first few weeks were quiet to quiet. I'd come home from work to silence instead of Mom's humming or Dad's news channel in the background, but with the quiet came clarity. For the first time, I wasn't anyone's backup plan or fixer. I was just me. I rented a small apartment overlooking the river. The walls were thin, the heater rattled, and the kitchen tiles were chipped, but it was mine. I spent nights cooking simple meals, watching the city lights shimmer off the water, telling myself I could start over. Still, the guilt clung to me. Every time I scrolled through social media, there was Emily posting selfies in Greece, sipping wine in Italy, captioning them, "You only live once." Mom would comment hearts on every photo. I'd close the app before the anger got too loud. One night, I got a text from Dad. "Hope you're doing well, son. We miss you." I stared at it for a long time. No mention of the house. No apology. Just a hollow attempt at pretending nothing had changed. I didn't reply. Instead, I stood by the window, the city buzzing below me, and whispered to myself, "You can't rebuild what they chose to burn." But deep down, I had no idea that the fire was only getting started. It had been nearly 8 months since I last spoke to my parents. Life had settled into something that almost resembled peace. I was working steadily, saving money, even starting to feel like myself again. But one rainy Thursday night, my phone rang out for some reason. I answered. Mom's voice was trembling. "Honey, we need to talk." Something in her tone made my chest tighten. I hadn't heard her sound that small since Grandpa's funeral. She told me the family was in a bit of a situation. The buyers who'd purchased our old house were planning to demolish it to build luxury condos. "They've already started tearing down the porch," she said, her voice cracking. "Your father's been sick with stress." I gripped the phone. "What did you expect, Mom?" "You sold it." There was silence, then a weak, guilty sigh. "We didn't think they'd destroy it. We thought it would go to another family, someone who'd love it like we did." For a second, I almost felt sorry for her until she added softly, "We were hoping you could help us out. We've fallen behind on bills. Your father's job cut hours. Maybe you could send something, just for now." It hit me like a punch. After everything, after selling the only home that ever meant something, they still wanted my help? I asked, "Did you ever stop to think about what that house meant to me?" Mom didn't answer directly. She just whispered, "You're stronger than us, sweetheart. We've always known that." It wasn't a compliment, it was manipulation disguised as love. I hung up without promising anything. That night, I sat in my dark apartment, staring at old photos of the house, its cracked porch. Its peeling paint, its soul end, felt something shift inside me. They'd destroyed my past for my sister's luxury. Now, I wasn't sure I wanted to be part of their future. Weeks passed after that phone call, and for a while, I convinced myself it was over. But trouble has a way of circling back when you least expect it. One afternoon, my cousin Mark called out of nowhere. His tone was hesitant, like he didn't want to be the messenger. "Hey, just so you know," he said quietly, "your parents are in bad shape. The credit collectors have been calling. Emily's back home too. Things are ugly over there." For a long time, I didn't say anything. I just listened to the hum of the city through my open window. Mark sighed. "I'm not saying you owe them anything, but maybe check in." I didn't, not right away. But curiosity or maybe guilt got the better of me. A few nights later, I looked up my sister's social media again. The European selfies had stopped. The posts were now vague quotes about learning from mistakes and cutting out toxic energy. Then one story caught my attention. A picture of our old home's empty lot. The caption read, "New beginnings always hurt." I called Mom the next day. Her voice was flat, emotionless. "Your father's been out of work. The market's bad. We're trying to get by." "Where's Emily?" I asked. "Here," she said bitterly. "She came back, broke. Said the world's unfair. We told her she'll figure it out." I hesitated, then said, "I can send a little money." "Not much, thank you," she whispered. But it sounded like routine gratitude, like I was just another utility bill being paid when I hung up. I sat there staring at the transfer receipt. I told myself it was the right thing to do, but deep down, it felt hollow. They hadn't learned anything, and I started to realize this wasn't a family in crisis. This was a cycle, one I had finally stepped out of, but they were still drowning, and they wanted to drag me back in. After that last call, I made a decision. I was done living like their emotional safety net. For years, I'd been the one patching up every hole they dug for themselves. But this time, I let the hole stay open. And in that space, something new started to grow. I threw myself into work. My supervisor noticed my focus and offered me a lead position on a new project. I accepted without hesitation. The extra hours were exhausting, but the paycheck felt like freedom. I upgraded to a better apartment, one with sunlight pouring through wide windows and enough room to breathe. I bought secondhand furniture, a few plants, even framed an old photo of Grandpa smiling on the porch, my reminder of what real love used to feel like. Slowly, my life started to feel whole. I'd wake up early, make coffee, and walk by the river before work. No shouting, no guilt, no expectations. Just peace. It was strange at first. Peace always feels unnatural to someone who grew up walking on eggshells, but I learned to trust it. Sometimes I'd still think about my parents. I wondered if they'd ever apologize or even acknowledge what they'd done. But nothing came, just silence, and maybe that was the answer I needed. Then one morning an invitation arrived in my mailbox. A thick ivory envelope with Emily's handwriting. "You're invited to celebrate the union of Emily and James." My sister was getting married. For a long time, I just stared at it. The idea of going back, of facing them after everything, made my stomach twist. But a voice inside me whispered, "You need closure." I didn't know what kind yet: peace, confrontation, or something in between. But I knew one thing. If I went back, I wasn't going as their scapegoat. I was going as the man they never thought I could become. The wedding was held at a country estate, a rented symbol of wealth that my family couldn't actually afford. As I stepped out of my car, the laughter of strangers and the faint sound of violins cut through the warm afternoon air. Everyone looked perfect, polished, fake. It was the kind of event where appearances mattered more than truth. When I walked inside, heads turned. My mother's smile faltered for a second before she rushed over. "You came," she said, voice trembling between guilt and relief. My father gave a curt nod, pretending to be busy greeting guests. Emily appeared moments later, radiant in her white dress. For a moment, I saw the little sister I used to protect. But then she spoke. "I'm surprised you showed up," she said, her tone sharp beneath the sweetness. "I figured you'd still be holding a grudge." I smiled thinly. "Guess I wanted to see what all the sacrifices paid for." Her expression hardened, but she quickly turned back to her guests. Dinner was unbearable. My parents bragged about Emily's hard-earned success, as if the last few years hadn't been built on lies and debt. Her fiancé, James, was polite but uncomfortable. When we finally spoke alone, he sighed and said quietly, "She told me you left the family for money, that you abandoned them." I almost laughed. "Money was never the problem," I said softly. "It was the price they put on love." Later that night, just before the first dance, my mother cornered me. "Your sister's honeymoon will be expensive," she said delicately. "You've been doing so well. Maybe you could help." I felt the old anger rise, but this time I didn't swallow it. I looked her dead in the eye and said, "You sold our home for her dreams. You already took everything I had." The music kept playing but at our table. The silence was deafening. After that confrontation, the air around me turned poisonous. My mother's expression went from shock to fury in seconds. "How dare you embarrass us like that?" she hissed, her voice trembling with humiliation. My father muttered something under his breath, shaking his head. Even Emily, standing a few feet away, looked ready to explode. I said quietly, You sold our family's legacy so your daughter could party in Europe. Emily's voice cut through the chatter of guests. You're so dramatic, Mark. You always think everything revolves around you. You're bitter because I actually live my life. People were starting to stare. Cameras lowered. The tension rippled like static. My father slammed his hand on the table and growled, Not here. You're ruining your sister's day. I stared at them, all these people I once called my family, and realized they didn't even see me as part of them anymore. I was just the mirror reflecting their selfishness back at them, and they hated the sight. I walked out before I said something I couldn't take back. Outside, the sky was dimming, the music faint behind the glass doors. I sat in my car, hands shaking, every memory flooding back, Dad teaching me to drive, Mom cheering at school plays, Emily laughing under the porch lights. All gone. I don't know how long I sat there, but by the time I drove off, the road blurred through tears I didn't want to shed. That night, in my empty apartment, I broke down completely. For the first time in years, I let it all out, the anger, the betrayal, the loneliness. It wasn't just about a house anymore. It was about realizing that no matter how much I gave, it would never be enough. And as I stared at the ceiling in the dark, I whispered to myself, I don't have a family anymore. But what I didn't know was that losing them was the beginning of something far greater. In the weeks after the wedding, I felt hollow, like I'd lost a war I never asked to fight. But grief has a strange way of sharpening you. Once the tears dried, something colder took their place. I wasn't going to beg for closure anymore. If they could trade love for money, then I'd learn how to play their game and win it my way. One night, while scrolling through real estate listings, I saw it, the same plot of land where our house once stood. It had been developed into luxury rentals, modern glass apartments built over the bones of my childhood. The company that owned it was local, small enough to invest in. My pulse quickened as an idea took root. I spent the next few months researching, calling, planning. Every spare dollar I had went into building my savings and studying real estate investment. I took online courses, partnered with a quiet investor I met at work, and started small buying into minor projects. Within 2 years, I doubled my money. Then, one rainy afternoon, I made my move. The development company listed fractional ownership stakes for investors. I bought one under an LLC, not a mansion, not revenge in flames, just a quiet, calculated step. A few months later, I owned a part of the land where my childhood home once stood. Standing outside that building for the first time felt surreal. The street smelled different. The old oak tree was gone. But when I closed my eyes, I could still hear Grandpa's laugh echoing through the yard. I smiled not out of bitterness, but power. They sold my past for a vacation. I had turned that loss into something permanent, and for the first time in years, I wasn't angry. I was ready. Because soon, my family would find out exactly what I'd done, and their illusions would finally shatter. It took me almost 3 years to reach the point where I could face them again. By then, my life looked nothing like the one they'd left behind. I owned a small townhouse, ran a modest consulting business, and finally understood what peace actually felt like. But closure still tugged at me, a quiet itch I couldn't ignore. So one weekend, I drove back to the town I once called home. The streets were smaller than I remembered. My parents' new place sat on the edge of town, a weathered rental duplex with a faded mailbox. When Mom opened the door, her face froze like she'd seen a ghost. Dad appeared behind her, older, thinner, his pride stripped down to silence. "Mark," Mom breathed, "you came." "I did," I said quietly, stepping inside. The living room smelled faintly of dust and regret. Family photos that once filled our old walls were crammed onto one small shelf. Emily wasn't there. Mom said she'd moved in with a friend after her marriage fell apart. The irony was almost poetic. They tried to make small talk how work was, how life had been, but the words fell flat. Finally, Dad asked, "So, what brings you back?" I took a deep breath. "I thought you should know I bought part of the development built on our old property." The silence that followed was absolute. Mom blinked like she hadn't heard me right. "You what?" "I own part of it," I repeated. "The land where the house stood, it's mine now." Dad's jaw tightened, eyes flickering with something between shame and disbelief. Mom's eyes filled with tears. "Why would you do that?" she whispered. I met her gaze. "Because you sold it like it meant nothing." I wanted to prove it still did. For the first time, they didn't have a single word to say. And that silence, that stunned, broken silence, was everything I'd waited years to hear. I left their house without slamming the door, without anger burning in my chest. For the first time, I wasn't walking away from my family. I was walking toward my own peace. Outside, the evening air was still, the sky bruised with sunset. I sat in my car for a long time, watching the light fade behind the town I once called home. Owning that land wasn't revenge anymore. It was reclamation. Every brick, every inch of soil was a reminder that I could take something broken and make it whole again on my own terms. The boy who used to beg for love was gone. In his place stood a man who'd learned that peace doesn't come from fixing others. It comes from freeing yourself. Months passed, life settled into something beautiful. I kept growing my business, quietly expanding my investments. When the quarterly earnings from that property rolled in, I didn't feel pride or triumph, just gratitude. I used part of it to start a small housing initiative for foster youth. Kids who, like me, had lost their sense of home before they ever had a chance to build one. Then, one morning, a letter arrived. My father's handwriting shaky, uneven. Inside was a single page. He wrote that he was sorry, that he'd been too proud to admit how deeply he regretted everything. He'd never sent it. Mom found it after his passing. She wanted me to have it. I drove back one last time and stood at the edge of that property where the porch once stood, where laughter used to echo. The world around me had changed, but the ground beneath my feet still felt familiar. They sold my past, I whispered, but I built my future. And as the wind moved through the trees, I realized the truth. Sometimes you don't rebuild what's broken, you simply grow beyond it.